Have you ever met someone who seems to have walls so high that no one can truly get close? Today we're exploring the psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone, a story that reveals how survival shapes the soul in ways most people never see. Emma was 7 years old when she realized no one was coming to save her. It wasn't a dramatic moment or a single catastrophic event. It was a slow accumulation of small abandonments, the repeated experience of calling out for help and hearing only silence in return. Her mother worked 3 jobs to keep them housed and fed, leaving before Emma woke and returning after she slept. Her father had left years before, a ghost she couldn't quite remember. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone begins in this quiet neglect, in the spaces where care should exist but doesn't. That night, Emma lay in bed, listening to strange sounds from the apartment next door. She was frightened, but she had learned that crying brought no comfort. She had learned that her mother, exhausted and overwhelmed, couldn't handle one more need, one more problem, one more demand on her depleted resources. So Emma did what she would do thousands of times throughout her childhood. She protected herself. She pulled the blanket over her head, created a small safe cave of fabric and darkness, and told herself stories until fear subsided enough to sleep. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone involves developing an entire internal system of safety when external safety is unavailable. Emma became expert at self-soothing. She learned to talk herself through fear, to reason with her own panic, to create imaginary companions who offered the reassurance real people didn't provide. Her mind built elaborate defense mechanisms because her environment offered no defense. What happens to a child's development when they must become their own protector? The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone reveals significant changes in attachment patterns, emotional regulation, and relationship formation. Emma's brain adapted to isolation. Her nervous system calibrated itself to expect danger and to trust only her own resources for managing it. By the time she was 8, Emma had already internalized a worldview that would shape her entire life. Other people are unreliable. Safety must be created internally, and asking for help is futile. Do you know someone who seems impossibly self-sufficient, who never asks for help even in crisis, who maintains emotional distance no matter how close you try to get? This is often the signature of the psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone. Emma moved through childhood like a small island, surrounded by water, but never truly connected to the mainland of human relationship. At school, teachers saw Emma as quiet and well-behaved. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone often manifests as excessive compliance and a desperate desire to avoid drawing attention. Emma never caused trouble because trouble meant unpredictable adult reactions, and unpredictability felt dangerous. She learned to read rooms with extraordinary accuracy, sensing mood shifts and adjusting her behavior to minimize risk. This hypervigilance became so automatic that Emma didn't even realize she was doing it. Other children found Emma strange. She didn't know how to play in the carefree way childhood play requires. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone includes difficulty with spontaneity and trust. Games require vulnerability, require believing that others would follow rules and not use your openness against you. Emma couldn't access that belief. She participated in games mechanically, always alert, never fully present, always prepared for a moment when play would turn to pain. Bullies sensed something different about Emma, and children can be cruel to difference. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone made Emma a target. She didn't have friends to defend her. She didn't have adults who monitored her well-being closely enough to notice. When classmates mocked her second-hand clothes or her social awkwardness, Emma didn't cry or fight back. She simply disappeared further into herself, adding more layers to protective walls she was building. But here's what most people misunderstand about the psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone. These defense mechanisms aren't character flaws or personality disorders. They're brilliant adaptations to impossible circumstances. Emma's self-protection strategies kept her functioning in an environment that would have broken many children. Her ability to rely on herself, to self-soothe, to create internal safety, these were survival skills that deserve recognition even as we acknowledge their cost. The cost was connection. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone creates profound loneliness. Emma existed in crowded classrooms, in apartment buildings full of people, in a world teeming with human life. Yet she experienced devastating isolation. She was surrounded by others, but fundamentally alone because she had learned that allowing anyone close meant risking pain she couldn't afford. As Emma entered adolescence, the patterns deepened. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone intensifies during teenage years, when peer relationships become central to development. Emma watched classmates form close friendships, romantic relationships, social groups, and she felt like an anthropologist observing a foreign culture. She understood intellectually how these connections worked, but couldn't access them emotionally. The vulnerability required for intimacy felt like standing naked in a snowstorm. Emma's first romantic relationship happened almost by accident. A boy in her class was persistent, patient, and willing to work around her walls rather than demanding she dismantle them. For a while, Emma thought maybe she had been wrong about people. Maybe connection was possible. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone includes these moments of hope when it seems like healing might happen organically through love. But relationships can't heal wounds they didn't create. When a relationship inevitably hit challenges, when her boyfriend needed emotional support and reciprocity that Emma didn't know how to provide, everything fell apart. Emma's default response to conflict was withdrawal. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone had taught her that when things get difficult, you retreat to your internal fortress and wait for the danger to pass. But relationships require staying present through difficulty, and Emma didn't have those skills. The breakup confirmed Emma's deepest beliefs about human connection. It was evidence that she had been right all along to protect herself, that opening up led to pain, that other people couldn't be trusted with your vulnerable places. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone creates self-fulfilling prophecies, where fear of abandonment produces behaviors that lead to abandonment, which then confirms the original fear. Have you experienced this cycle in your own life, or watched someone you care about repeat these patterns? The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone is heartbreaking because the very strategies that ensure survival also ensure isolation. Emma was trapped in a paradox. She desperately wanted connection but was terrified of the vulnerability connection requires. Her self-protection had become a prison. Emma's mother, now in her 50s and working fewer hours, began to notice what she had missed during Emma's childhood. She saw her daughter's isolation, her emotional distance, her inability to build close relationships. Guilt consumed her, but the psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone also affects parents who realize too late what their circumstances created. Emma's mother had been doing her best to provide material survival, but in focusing on food and shelter, she had inadvertently left Emma to face emotional survival alone. When Emma's mother tried to apologize, tried to bridge the distance between them, Emma couldn't receive it. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone makes accepting care feel dangerous even when it's finally offered. Emma had spent 20 years learning that needing her mother was futile. She couldn't suddenly unlearn that because circumstances had changed. Her mother's attempt at closeness felt threatening rather than comforting. Emma's breaking point came at 23. She was working as a data analyst, a job that suited her perfectly because it required minimal human interaction. She was competent, reliable, and completely miserable. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone had led Emma to a life that was safe but empty. She had everything she thought she wanted, complete control over her environment, and no one close enough to hurt her, but the loneliness was becoming unbearable. One night, Emma found herself searching online for information about attachment styles and childhood trauma. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone appeared on her screen in academic language, described by researchers who had studied thousands of people with similar patterns. Emma read through the night, tears streaming down her face as she recognized herself in every description. For the first time, she understood that her struggles weren't personal failures. They were predictable outcomes of growing up without consistent care and protection. This understanding didn't fix anything immediately, but it opened a door. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone can be addressed once it's recognized and named. Emma started therapy, though her first several attempts failed. She cycled through therapists, finding reasons to quit each time things got uncomfortable. The The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone makes therapy particularly challenging because therapy requires exactly what these clients find most terrifying: trusting another person with your vulnerability. Her fourth therapist, Dr. Chun, took a different approach. She didn't push Emma to open up or process trauma before Emma was ready. Instead, she taught Emma about her nervous system, about how the psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone creates specific patterns in the body and brain. She helped Emma understand that her hypervigilance, her difficulty trusting, her automatic withdrawal, these weren't conscious choices. They were nervous system responses programmed by years of having to protect herself alone. This psychoeducation was revolutionary for Emma. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone begins to shift when the person understands they're not broken, just adapted to circumstances that required adaptation. Emma started learning to track her nervous system states, to notice when she was moving into protective mode, to understand the triggers that activated her defense mechanisms. Awareness didn't immediately change the patterns, but it created space between stimulus and response where choice could eventually emerge. Dr. Chen also introduced Emma to the concept of earned secure attachment. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone isn't a permanent condition. Through consistent therapeutic relationship and deliberate practice, people can develop the attachment security they didn't receive in childhood. Emma was skeptical, but desperate enough to try. The work was painfully slow. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone took years to develop and couldn't be dismantled in weeks or months. Emma practiced tiny acts of vulnerability in therapy. She admitted when she was scared. She told Dr. Chun when she wanted to quit. She allowed herself to be seen in moments of struggle, rather than maintaining her usual composed facade. Each time she took these risks and Dr. Chun responded with consistency and care, a small new neural pathway formed in Emma's brain, suggesting that maybe, sometimes, with some people, vulnerability might be safe. What do you think it takes to unlearn the lessons childhood taught about safety and trust? The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone requires not just understanding, but repeated corrective experiences. Emma needed hundreds of interactions where opening up didn't lead to abandonment, where needing someone didn't result in rejection, where showing weakness didn't invite harm. Dr. Chin provided these experiences consistently over 3 years of weekly therapy. Gradually, Emma began to risk connection outside the therapy room. She joined a book club, forcing herself to attend even when her instinct was to cancel. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone makes social situations feel exhausting because the hypervigilance never quite turns off. Emma had to consciously practice staying present instead of retreating into observation mode. She had to fight the urge to leave early, to keep conversations superficial, to maintain an emotional distance that felt safe. One woman in the book club, Rachel, seemed particularly warm and interested in friendship. Emma's automatic response was suspicion. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone interprets kindness as manipulation, assuming people want something or will eventually disappoint. But Emma was committed to trying something different. She accepted Rachel's invitations for coffee. She practiced sharing small pieces of her life. She allowed the friendship to develop despite her terror. The friendship with Rachel became a laboratory for practicing new patterns. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone is challenged most directly in relationship. When Rachel shared her own struggles, Emma practiced staying present and offering support instead of withdrawing. When Emma had a difficult week, she practiced telling Rachel instead of isolating. Each of these small acts of connection felt risky, but they also felt increasingly necessary. Emma was beginning to understand that humans aren't meant to protect themselves alone, that we're wired for interdependence, and that her childhood had forced her to override fundamental human needs. But growth isn't linear. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone includes setbacks and regressions. When Rachel canceled plans at the last minute due to a family emergency, Emma's immediate reaction was to assume the friendship was over, that Rachel had finally seen through her and was pulling away. The old patterns activated instantly, flooding Emma's system with familiar messages about the futility of trusting others. Instead of disappearing as she would have done before, Emma brought this reaction to therapy. Dr. Chin helped her see how her nervous system was interpreting present disappointment through the lens of past abandonment. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone means the brain is always scanning for evidence that confirms old beliefs. Emma practiced considering alternative explanations, allowing space for the possibility that Rachel's cancellation was about Rachel's life rather than Emma's worth. Emma texted Rachel saying she understood and hoped everything was okay with her family. Rachel responded with gratitude and rescheduled immediately. This small interaction provided more evidence that Emma's fears weren't always accurate, that people could be temporarily unavailable without permanently abandoning her. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone begins to loosen its grip through accumulated experiences that contradict its core beliefs. Now in her late 20s, Emma decided to pursue a master's degree in social work. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone had given her profound empathy for others navigating difficult circumstances. She wanted to use her hard-won insights to help children who were currently experiencing what she had survived. Emma's graduate work focused on attachment theory and interventions for children in neglectful or chaotic home environments. Her research revealed how common the psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone actually is. Millions of children grow up in circumstances where adults are too overwhelmed, too absent, too struggle with their own demons to provide consistent care and protection. These children develop the same patterns Emma had: the self-sufficiency born from necessity, the walls built for survival, the deep loneliness hidden behind competent facades. Emma's clinical training put her face to face with children currently living her childhood. She saw 7-year-olds with the same hypervigilance she remembered, the same careful monitoring of adult moods, the same inability to trust that help would come if they asked. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone was playing out in real time in her clients, and Emma was determined to intervene before these patterns became as entrenched as hers had been. She created interventions focused on helping children develop trust gradually and safely. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone can be prevented or mitigated when caring adults consistently show up, follow through on promises, and demonstrate that protection is available. Emma worked with foster families, teaching them how to earn trust from children whose experience taught them that adults were unreliable. She helped these families understand that a child's emotional distance was a rejection, but self-protection born from necessity. Emma also worked with the biological parents when possible, helping them understand how their own trauma and overwhelm affected their children. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone often passes through generations. Emma's mother had grown up with similar neglect and simply didn't know another way to parent. Breaking these cycles requires awareness, resources, and support that many families lack. Through this work, Emma found meaning in her pain. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone had shaped her profoundly, but had also given her unique insight into trauma and resilience. She could reach children others couldn't because she knew exactly what they were experiencing. She could offer hope because she was living proof that these patterns, while powerful, aren't permanent. Emma's relationship with her mother also began to heal during this period. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone affects family systems long after childhood ends. Emma's graduate education helped her understand her mother's circumstances more fully, to see the impossible position her mother had been in as a single parent without support or resources. This understanding didn't erase the pain of Emma's childhood, but it created space for compassion alongside the hurt. Her mother attended therapy herself, working through guilt and learning to be the mother Emma needed now, even though she couldn't be that mother back then. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone doesn't require that childhood wounds be perfectly repaired, but healing is supported when family members can acknowledge what happened and commit to doing better going forward. Do you recognize these patterns in yourself or your family? The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone is far more common than most people realize. If you're watching this and seeing yourself in Emma's story, please know that you're not alone and that change is possible. The walls you built served a purpose. They protected you when you needed protection. But you get to decide now whether you still need those walls at the same height. Emma still struggles sometimes. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone left lasting imprints that don't disappear completely. When stress increases, Emma's default is still withdrawal. She still has to consciously fight the urge to handle everything alone. She still experiences moments of panic when people get too close. But she now has tools, awareness, and a support system. She knows her patterns and can interrupt them before they sabotage the connection she's building. She's in a relationship now with someone who understands her history and is patient with her process. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone makes intimate relationships particularly challenging, but Emma has learned to communicate her needs and patterns clearly. When she feels the walls going up, she can say, "I'm struggling with closeness right now. It's not about you. I need a little space, but I'm not leaving." This kind of communication was impossible before therapy because Emma didn't have language for her internal experience. Her partner, Marcus, has his own history of childhood trauma, which creates understanding but also requires careful navigation. The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone can lead people to choose partners with similar patterns, creating relationships where both people struggle with intimacy and trust. Emma and Marcus attend couples therapy to work through their patterns together, learning to build security through mutual vulnerability rather than mutual defense. What would Emma tell the 7-year-old girl she was, pulling blankets over her head to feel safe? The psychology of a child who learned to protect themselves alone includes this desire to reach back through time and offer comfort to our younger selves. Emma would tell that little girl that she was resourceful and brave, that her self-protection was intelligent adaptation to difficult circumstances.